I want to welcome you to the webinar, Proposition 6 Possibilities, Funding Water Projects Through New and Existing Resources. My name is Alyssa Knox. I'm a planner in the Environment and Development Department with the North Central Texas Council of Governments, or NCTCOG for short. This webinar is hosted by NCTCOG and was prepared in cooperation with TCEQ and the US EPA, and I am pleased to be your moderator today. Some background on what NCTCOG is. NCTCOG is a voluntary association of local governments. It is one of 24 regional councils in the state of Texas. Part of NCTCOG's water quality management planning work involves hosting quarterly webinars on water quality and water resources topics. If you have any ideas for future webinars, we would love to hear them. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you can feel free to contact me and let me know what you think. Okay. You should have all just received that. So a few quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar will last until about 2:15 Central Standard Time. We're going to hear from our speaker, Scott Galloway, today, and then afterwards there will be time for questions. To submit your questions, I will give you some instructions on how to do that a little bit later, but please remember to keep your microphone on mute in the meantime until we get there. I will be sending a follow-up email with a recording link and presentation slides to everyone who RSVP'd. If you did not RSVP but would still like those webinar materials, you can email me at the email provided. That's aknox@nctcog.org. You can also find the presentation slides on NCTCOG's Water Resources page under the green banner webinars, and the link is in the chat right there. Okay, so today we'll be hearing from Scott Galloway, who will present on Texas Water Development Board's financial assistance programs, including the new Texas Water Fund and the State Revolving Fund. And like I said, there will be time for questions and answers after the presentation. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Scott Galloway. Scott Galloway is an outreach specialist with the Texas Water Development Board. He promotes Texas Water Development Board's financial assistance programs and helps utilities and communities find options for financing water-related infrastructure. Scott has over 3 decades of experience with utility operations and management, including construction and project management for state and federally funded programs. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Texas State University and is a licensed water and wastewater operator. Scott, welcome. You may begin your presentation.
Well, thank you, Alyssa. Thanks for the introduction. Turn my camera on here. Okay. I think I'm ready to go, and just like to welcome everyone for joining us this afternoon for a little briefing on Texas Water Development Board, Proposition 6, and funding water projects through the new and existing resources. And again, as Alyssa mentioned, my name is Scott Galloway. I'm an outreach specialist with TWDB, a non-regulatory state agency. So we'll talk about these items this afternoon. New funding programs. I'm going to share with you some of the details of that, timelines, implementation plans, and then finally at the end of the presentation, a couple of links where you can get more information and a way to subscribe to keep up with activities and information going on at Texas Water Development Board. So next slide, please. So this is a little bit of an agenda today. What is the TWDB? What financing do we offer? And infrastructure, how can we help with your infrastructure project funding? Next, please. And so as most folks know, Texas Water Development Board is a non-regulatory state agency. We are water resource planners, and we function like a bank. And so this is a kind of a clever little flow of water and flow of information through our system. So we're interested in all types of water-related science: surface water, groundwater, climate data, water use data, water conservation information, on and on and on. And so the idea is we collect data, we use that for our planning purposes, and then we function like a bank. We have low interest loans and some grant opportunities for public entities of Texas, political subdivisions of Texas. And so you must be a political subdivision. We'll talk about those details in a few minutes, but the overall mission of the Water Development Board is a secure water supply for the future. Next up, please. Next slide, please. And so one thing that we do is we publish the state water plan. The state water plan, as you can see here, has been published over the decades. The current plan that we're under is 2022, with the next revision coming out in 2027. And so that data information that I mentioned, a lot of local utilities, a lot of local entities prepare and provide that data to the Water Development Board. We use that data in our planning processes and then eventually publish the state water plan. And that's important as we come up to a couple of specific funding programs, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Next, please. So what is the water plan? The state's divided up into 16 regional water planning groups. These are local groups of public utility directors, mayors, policy leaders, water industry people in your area. The local regional planning groups produce a regional plan. Texas Water Development Board takes those 16 regional plans and then roll them up into the state water plan. And the idea is it's local control, it's local input, local control on water resources in your area. Locals know their systems the best, they know their needs the best, and so then the water plan is those regional plans are produced and then rolled up into the state water plan, looking at a 50-year planning horizon. Are we going to have adequate water supplies? That's the gist of it. The key for this particular meeting today, if a local entity, a local utility, a city, a municipal utility district has their project identified and vetted in these regional planning groups, that this gives you another option of funding opportunities. So the idea is you have local planning, go through the planning process, and then you have additional funding specifically for water supply projects. And that will be in a program coming up next, a SWIFT program specifically for water planning in Texas. So next slide, please. We are also doing that on the flood planning group. And a couple of years ago, Texas legislature adopted the first flood planning activities for the state. Again, the state's broken up into 15 regional flood planning groups, go through the process of having your project identified in a flood mitigation plan document, and then the local political entity would have opportunities for additional flood planning through the Flood Infrastructure Fund that we'll talk about in a few minutes too. Next, please. So the flood planning group that's new for Texas, the very first ever state flood plan is scheduled to be published in September of 2024. And so these first regional planning groups were submitted last January, and they're being incorporated into the first flood plan for the state. Next item, please. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background history. So we're water resource planners and bankers. So since 1957, when the Water Development Board was first developed or first instituted, we've committed over $33.6 billion in water-related funding since the 50s. So next slide, please. So why do communities come to the Water Development Board? When I'm talking about communities, remember I'm talking about political subdivisions of the state. That can be a city, county, river authority, district. There's lots of different types of political subdivisions that are districts. They can be everything from a municipal utility district, a special utility district, water control and improvement district, levy district, and even school districts, public school districts. There's quite a few public school districts that may have like a water well at a rural campus, for instance. They're a public water supply providing drinking water to their campus. They are eligible for these funding programs too, if they fit into that category of providing a public utility at one of their campuses. But communities come to us for dollar savings on interest rates. Our interest rates are always below market interest rates. Either our federal programs that we offer or our state dollar program, they're all subsidized to give you a better interest rate as opposed to going to a local lender, a private bank. And so this is a fun table that I like. It shows what a community is offered and then the cost savings by coming to the Water Development Board as opposed to issuing your own bonds or going to the private open market. Next slide, please. We publish our interest rates, example interest rates on our website. That's updated weekly. Good general rule of thumb, whatever open market is, the market rate is, TWDB can offer typically 1 to 1.5 percentage points below open market rate. But just like a home mortgage or an auto loan, there's a lot of factors that go into that rating. So we can talk about that in details, but just know we have the best interest rates available for any public entity looking for water-related infrastructure funding. Next, please. So how can these programs work for your infrastructure project if you're a local city or a district? We have funding to accommodate all sizes of projects, typically larger projects, usually around $150,000 and upwards, multi-million-dollar projects. Some of our projects, you can combine a variety of sources of funding to complete your project, and then all project phases are eligible. And when we talk about funding, when I talk about funding, we're talking about a specific project. So what's the definition of a project? That could be something as simple as a new drinking water well, line work installation, a treatment plant, pump stations, flood mitigation projects. On the wastewater side, it could be a treatment plant, lift stations, headworks, digesters, collection systems, typically items that would be found in a capital improvements project, some type of infrastructure for either improvements to a utility system or expansion of a utility system. And so the different phases of our projects are divided up into planning phase, that would be like for permitting and feasibility studies, a design phase, which would be a consulting engineer's actual design of what's being constructed, and then the acquisition period or portion. If a community needs to purchase land for a new well site or land for a new treatment works facility, we can also finance that purchase of property. And then finally, construction. And then construction can be new construction, new existing facility or new facilities, or rehabilitation of existing facilities. The TWDB does a lot of work on rehabbing and expanding existing facilities. So those are kind of the big phases of our projects. The red box that I want to call your attention to, the AAA bond rating is Texas, state of Texas bond rating. Texas is blessed with AAA rating from some of their credit rating agencies such as Fitch and Standard & Poor's. That particular box comes into significant play when you start talking about state dollar programs. If a local community has a poor rating or they're not rating, what they can do is piggyback on Texas AAA bond rating to get the best interest rate for their particular project. So next slide, please. One thing that's exciting with the Texas Water Development Board is we have a lot of new money. As most of you probably are aware that there was a constitutional amendment back in November of last year. There were numerous infrastructure-related funding propositions. The voters overwhelmingly approved Proposition 6, which basically grants the Texas Water Development Board $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion of new infrastructure water-related financing. And you can see there the voters overwhelmingly approved most of these resolutions. Links to some of the legislation that created this fund and some of the details behind it. Next slide, please. The Texas Comptroller's Office put together this Texas Water Present and Future. That really speaks to a lot of the mechanics of the funding, how the funds get from the general ledger, I suppose, with state government into the Water Development Board's hands for infrastructure-related funding. And then the Texas Water Development Board has a frequently asked question document published on our website that gives more insight and a timeline for the implementation plan for this new funds that we're calling the Texas Water Fund, or the new Texas Water Fund. So you may hear it related to Proposition 6 or the new legislation or the Texas Water Fund. It's all the same thing. Next slide, please. So what does the Texas Water Fund do? Proposition 6, new Texas Water Fund. One thing that's really great is it transfers funds to certain existing TWDB financial assistance programs. And I think most communities know that we offer a wide variety of funding programs. We have 2 federal programs. Those are the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. These are federal funds through the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. All 50 states and U.S. territories participate in the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds program. We've had these programs for numerous decades, going all the way back to the 80s and 90s. These are some of our traditional programs that have been very popular. But what the new Texas Water Fund is able to do has a lot of flexibility. These programs that are listed here, most of them are existing programs, and basically they're active programs, but some of them for many years have not had any actual dollars associated with the program. Great example of that is the Rural Water Assistance Fund. It's been an active program, but we haven't actually had cash or dollars available in that particular program for quite some time. With this new Texas Water Fund from Proposition 6, we'll be able to fund that program and some additional programs. And the Texas Water Fund creates a new category of funding, the Texas Water Fund. We'll talk about those details in a few minutes. And it also creates a statewide water public awareness campaign. So the good thing is we have more money than we've had in the past. And the idea is to try to stretch and match both the state dollars and the federal dollars to their maximum. We want to leverage these funds to benefit all Texans, all water utility related systems. And the way we're doing that is a mix and match of existing programs and some new programs. So the next slide, please. We just launched a website just a couple of weeks ago for the new Texas Water Fund. It gives you some details about that, the link that it's on. There's some stakeholder opportunities right now for public information and stakeholder opportunity. One is there are 3 surveys published on this website. We're asking the public to go to these websites and fill out these surveys. Please let your voice be heard on how these new programs will be implemented and pushed out to the public utilities over these next year or so. So please fill that information out. Those public comment periods end, I believe it's April 30th, so you still have quite a bit of time to let your voice be heard about that. And then we're on March 20th, a public stakeholder meeting. It's going to be an in-person meeting in Austin, Texas, but there'll also be some virtual options available. Next slide, please. And so this slide just kind of summarizes up what I just mentioned. There's the 3 surveys that we would like for input to be provided by the stakeholders and the public, and then the stakeholder meeting. There'll probably be some additional stakeholder meetings too, but this is the current one that we have scheduled March 20th. Next slide, please. On the website, this is just a straight copy paste of the implementation timeline. This is a dynamic timeline. As you see, I have a little notation there, timeline subject to change. But this information is current right now, but as we move, especially through the spring and summer and into the fall, there'll probably be some updates with the implementation timeline. The first part is the stakeholder input, and then we will start looking at how to approve these dollars for the awareness campaign and into the infrastructure portion of it. Next slide, please. And then just a little bit of wrap up for the summer and the fall and the winter of 2025. Right now, the timeline is with these new Texas Water Fund dollars, we're going through the public comment period, developing rules, procedures, policy, all with the new Texas Water Fund in mind. And then probably though, spring of 2025 will be dollars in hand, dollars available for political subdivisions of the state to tap into this new Texas Water Fund for infrastructure funding. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a few minutes ago earlier that we have two federal programs, and then this particular slide shows some of our most popular financial assistance programs. As you know, probably all of these state dollar programs and then the two federal programs were developed either by a Texas legislative session or a congressional session. So they all kind of have their own little personality, I suppose, if you will, and scope of work of how they function. But they're all related to drinking water, wastewater, or flood mitigation infrastructure projects. And so when I say infrastructure projects, these are projects that that communities are building to either improve their systems or add new systems to their facilities. It's typically any type, our funding is available for any type of infrastructure related funding. The only thing we can't finance when it comes to utility operations or operations and maintenance cost. But if it's a capital type of expense, usually we can fund that type of activity. Next slide, please. So we'll just go over quickly the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. This is a federal program. Long-term links are either 20 or 30 years typically. This fiscal year, we have $460 million. The project information form, that's the initial application document that we call the PIF, Project Information Form, is due March 1st. So in a couple of weeks, that project is due, or that application is due for this particular program. One thing that's real important to know and remember as you're dealing with all of these variety of funding programs, each one is its own program, so it's independent or separate from the other funding programs. We follow the state fiscal year, so things that are true for all these funding programs this year will probably be different than last year. They'll probably be different next year. And so when I'm saying the difference is based on a fiscal year, it's things like what is the capacity dollar amount that's available. Typically, it's around this much for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, $460 million. Next year, it'll probably be a little different, so on and so forth. Keep that in mind, though. Things that were happened if you've used the Water Development Board funding in the past, especially if it was several years ago, things are going to look different than today. So this particular program, again, is a federal program. The two federal programs do have a grant opportunity. And it's not technically a grant, it's really loan principal forgiveness. All of our programs usually have a loan component and a grant component or principal loan forgiveness component with it. This year and last year, the loan principal forgiveness was 70%. You got a 70% grant and you had to take on a 30% loan. So if you had $1 million project, you only had to pay back $300,000 of it. So, but those type of details, the capacity dollar amounts, the percentages of breakdown between grant, principal loan forgiveness, and actual loan, those type of details do change from year to year. So that's something important to keep in mind. Most communities on all of our funding programs, both the state and the federal program, they tie the loan repayment to water and sewer revenue. That's the most common way communities finance these projects, but you don't have to. As you can see in that typical pledges, it can be just about any type of revenue taxation on the way to pay back the loan component. Say one more thing and then we'll skip to the drinking water. This is true on both the drinking water and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. The clean water is wastewater. Wastewater and point source pollution and even some bay and estuary programs, but that's on the clean water side. And the drinking water, of course, obvious, is more drinking water related. But most communities, let me just make this announcement, most communities want to know, how do we tap into the principal loan forgiveness or the grant portion? There are about 30 different data points in the criteria form that we use to review and rank projects, but the 4 biggest criteria points to capture loan forgiveness dollars are these items right here. If the community is considered a economic disadvantaged community, and that's based on a U.S. Census Bureau figure for median household income. So if you're a city or a county, you can look up annual median household income for your system pretty easily, and we go by that number. If you're a large district, you may have to divert to census blocks and tracts to figure out your annual median household income, but that's one of the biggest criteria for obtaining loan principal forgiveness. The other big ones are if you're a small and rural community in a very small system, if you're doing emergency preparedness and urgent need, or green. And green can be water and energy savings of any type. Emergency preparedness and urgent need, of course, are more emergency related. But really the 4 big ones are disadvantage, if you're small, if you're rural, and then the final one too that's not listed on this slide, if you're facing regulatory enforcement notice or action. EPA, TCEQ, they want you to be in compliance. We want you to be in compliance. So if you are not in compliance, we want you to use these funds to get back in compliance with permitting processes. And so those are some of the big criteria points. These programs, you can switch to the drinking water. It's almost the same information, just a little bit of dollar difference, $435 million for this fiscal year, but pretty much they act and function the same way between clean water and drinking water. But these programs, again, people or local utilities submit these project information forms. That's about a 5 or 6 page document saying who, what, when, and where. Scope of work and a budget, a project budget will be the most detailed information that a community will need to submit to us. These programs are on an annual basis, so you would need to submit, some communities submit applications to us annually for different projects. But these projects, since they have the grant opportunities, they are extremely competitive. A lot of communities from all across the state submit applications for the Drinking Water State Revolving Program and the Clean Water State Revolving Program. And I think I have a slide coming up here in a moment to show kind of that process. So next slide, please. Oh, this coming up in a couple of slides. There is 2 new categories of funding that are carve-outs or subsets of the Drinking Water Program. This one is for emerging contaminants. What is an emerging contaminants? These are some chemicals that are starting to be known as forever chemicals, pharmaceuticals, painting equipment, non-cooked stickware, those type of things are starting to show up in our drinking water supplies. Currently, most of these chemicals do not have a parameter associated with them from EPA, such as a parts per million parameter like we have for nuclei radii and arsenic and those type of things. But they will sometime, probably in the future, is my speculation. However, these 2 carve-outs for emerging contaminants, there's one for clean water and one for drinking water. It's mainly for evaluation if your community is dealing with any of these kind of chemicals, but it needs to address not only analysis and sampling, but the sampling would need to address or lead to some type of capital project, treatment project, or something like that in the future. Next item, please. And then there's a lead service line replacement program. And as you notice, the day dates are a little different on these 2. The emerging contaminants and lead are for April 1st. These are subsets or additional supplemental funds from the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. It was a one-time supplement to the Water Development Board and communities across the country that participate in the state revolving fund. But there are two of these subsets for emerging contaminants and then the lead program. Next slide, please. So here's the slide I was mentioning a moment ago. There are two steps for the federal side, for the project and information form, and then a document called the intended use plan. The project information form is that initial applications that communities will submit for the federal dollars. The intended use plan is a document the Water Development Board publishes and produces. It basically lets the public know how we're using these funds, and then it's also a reporting tool back to EPA, how Texas is using these funds. So it's a two-step process annually. Your communities are submitting the applications. We're preparing the intended use plan. It goes through a review and ranking process, a public comment period, and then finally the Water Development Board would adopt the final intended use plan. That intended use plan will list all the applications that were received and applications that were deemed eligible and invited to submit a formal application. So this flow chart is showing you just the initial screening process, the open solicitation period, review and ranking. Then we do the initial review process. And then after we adopt the intended use plan, communities that make the invited list will be requested to submit a full application to select these funds. Next slide, please. This is really just kind of an internal view of what those loan application steps look like. After you've been invited to submit a full application, then there's a lot of behind the scenes processing of those application documents. Typically takes from initial application, for instance, March 1 to dollars in hand, typically is about an 18-month to 2-year process. It's a long, lengthy process. But again, we have more applicants than we have funds, so we do have to go through a review and ranking criteria on these federal dollar programs. Next slide, please. One thing that I wanted to mention about the intended use plan, that's a really great resource. Past intended use plans are available on our website in a PDF document. It's just a great resource to see how the program functions, how application criteria are ranked. All the details of the program are listed in that intended use plan. So it is a very valuable resource if you're submitting applications for the federal projects or federal dollars for Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. These next few slides are specifically on state dollar programs. And this first one is the SWIFT program. This is the program for drinking water supplies. It's been in existence for several years now. But to tap into this particular program and fund, your project has to be identified and vetted both by a regional planning group and then in the state water plan. And so if you go through that process of having your project reviewed and identified in those regional and state water planning processes, the idea is that after those projects are listed in those planning documents, then you have access to this SWIFT fund. The SWIFT fund is very specific for projects that are identified in the state water plan. You don't have to go through that process, but if you're a city especially, or any public entity, this is the opportunity to let your voice be heard, what's happening in your local area for water, drinking water kind of supply planning. And then you can have your project vetted and identified in this plan. And then finally, the light at the end of the tunnel, you have an opportunity to tap into the SWIFT dollars. You're not required to. You can use any of our programs, but as long as your project is vetted in the water plan, you have an option here for additional funding. Next slide, please. The next state dollar program is the Economically Distressed Areas Program. Currently, we're not accepting applications from this new program, from this existing program, but as you can see, it is not eligible for the new Texas Water Fund, where the SWIFT program is. We will be receiving a solicitation period, probably starting sometime this summer. but mainly this particular program, you have to have, it has to be for brand new drinking water service or brand new sanitary sewer collection service. And you have to follow and be enforcing the model subdivision rules for community. Again, it's based on annual household median income for a figure for this particular program. So it's basically a program for poor communities who don't have adequate drinking water or wastewater systems. Next, please. This next program, the Texas Rural Water Assistance Program, it is eligible to receive funds from the new Texas Water Supply Fund. So that's good. This program has been active for quite some time, for many years, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's been no actual cash or dollar associated with this program. So now the new Texas Water Fund can just hopefully make cash deposits into this program, and we can stretch these dollars into more rural community type projects. You do both drinking water and wastewater out of this project, out of this particular fund. Again, we're looking at late 2025 or the summer of 2025 before dollars will be available for this particular fund. Next, please. The State Water Participation Program, again, we're not accepting applications right now. Timeline to be determined, but it's eligible to receive funds from the new Texas Water Fund. So again, it's one of these programs that's been active, but there hasn't been any cash in it. Now there will be with the new Texas Water Fund. This particular program is very unique. It allows communities to kind of build, I always use the example of a drinking water system, especially in some of these areas of the state where there's a tremendous amount of demand for drinking water, tremendous amount of population growth. For instance, if a drinking water system knows that there's a large demand on their system, but they don't have the revenue from selling water yet to meet a large construction project, what can happen with this particular program is the Water Development Board can participate with a local entity. The idea is you could build a drinking water plant right size the first time and not have to do small treatment plants and then expand as your area grows and the demand is needed. The idea behind this one, you build it right size the first time, and then as your community grows with population and you have revenue, you slowly buy the Water Development Board out of the project, and at the end of the long terms, the local community would own the asset outright. So it's just a very flexible way to develop drinking water systems. Next slide, please. Texas Water Development Fund. This is our oldest state dollar program. You can do a variety of projects in this program. You can do drinking water, wastewater, and flood control, all within one funding umbrella, where most of our programs are separated out by very specific, drinking water, wastewater, flood. This one can do it all. This particular program is 100% low interest loan, but again, it's based on interest rates are subsidized, so it's below market interest rates. This particular program says call us for availability of funding. The way we handle this program over the spring and summer, we'll start an open solicitation period. Once we get those applications in-house, if they meet all the eligibility requirements, then the Water Development Board combines all those dollar amounts into a single dollar amount, and the Water Development Board can go out and issue bonds on your behalf. It's state of Texas bonds based on the need for a particular community, but we can issue those bonds and then loan those proceeds out to communities. So this is kind of a revolving fund as we're loaning dollars out. Other communities in the past are paying money into the program. There's no review or ranking of this particular program. It's basically just if your project meets all the eligibility requirements, it is a great option for communities to move through the process. And then on that D-Fund program, it usually takes about a year and a half from application time period to dollars in hand for a construction project or planning for a construction project. The next state dollar program is the Flood Infrastructure Fund. Again, this is a program that's fairly new to the Water Development Board. We've had one funding cycle prior. We have a current funding cycle that abridged applications are due April 15th. But again, this is kind of back to the water planning process. The state's divided up into regional flood planning groups. Communities' projects have to be identified in those regional plans, and then they'll be rolled up into the state water planning process. And then at the end of the day, if you've gone through all those planning requirements, you have an opportunity to tap into the Flood Infrastructure Fund for flood mitigation projects. And there's a wide variety of eligible activities. It can be planning, construction, nature-based solutions, warning systems such as barriers at low water crossings or upstream warning devices, and even flood gauge processes. So keep that in mind as that's coming up too for flood planning processes. Okay, next slide, please. Two new programs. Just want to highlight the actual application period is ended for this current round of funding cycle, but it will be open again next fall. But it's designed for very small systems. These next two programs that we're going to talk about, this asset management program for small systems, these are for small disadvantaged communities to partner with a consulting engineering firm that has been pre-selected by the Water Development Board that can come out and help you with developing an asset management program. You can get up to $100,000 worth of consulting engineering services for communities, really small communities, serving 5,000 population or 10,000 population or less. They can develop asset management plans, help you with compliance manuals, training for your staff. It's just this is our second round of funding. It's been well received. We hope to expand this particular program in the future to allow more small communities to tap into some resources that they normally don't have access to. And the next slide, please. This one also mimics that asset management program. It's Water Utility Technical Assistance Program. Again, the Water Development Board is partnered with some consulting engineering firms, and they can come out and help you develop up to $150,000 worth of services, things like applications for financial assistance, either Water Development Board or some other state and federal agencies that offer water-related funding, water rate studies, conservation programs, help with disadvantaged business enterprise programs. It's again, it's just really kind of consulting services for some of these smallest communities that we deal with across the state. Next slide, please. So just a handy little graph showing what's coming up. Typically, late winter and early spring is a deadline busy season for the Water Development Board. These type of timelines notate that they typically are in the late fall and early spring each year, but they do vary from year to year. The dates are pretty well consistent, but some of the details of the programs, again, dollar amount capacities, percentages of principal loan forgiveness, those type of details could change from year to year. Next slide, please. How can communities prepare now? If you have a city or a county or a district, what can they do now to prepare? One of the biggest obstacles that some small systems really have a challenge with is a financial audit, an independent financial audit. For a variety of reasons, they may not be current, they may not have done an audit in the past. That's a great starting point to make sure that a community is up to date on their financial audits, because that's one document of what the Water Development Board is going to want to review. You don't have to be updated on your financial audit to submit an application, but to close the dollars, to actually obtain the dollars and have them in hand, you will have to go through a financial audit at some point. If you're a water supply corporation, a nonprofit water supply corporation, there are some IRS forms that can be substituted in lieu of a financial assistance or financial audit rather, but that's only for nonprofit water supply corporations. If you're a city or a county or other type of district, you're going to need to have an independent financial audit. And then ability to take on debt. As I mentioned, we do have some grant opportunities and principal loan forgiveness, but most of our funding programs also have a loan component of some sort. And so how is the local community going to be able to repay us? Well, your water and sewer rates need to be raised. Has analysis been done on how you're going to repay Water Development Board? Those are some things, again, that are things to think about when you're considering applying for our funding. And again, you don't have to tie the loan replacement or the loan repayment to water and sewer rates, but most communities seem to do that. That's probably the most popular way to repay us, but it can be any type of taxation revenue. We do collect data. If you're on the drinking water side, annually we submit or request you to submit water use surveys and water loss audit information to us, water conservation and drought contingency planning. If you meet those criteria, we want to make sure you're up to date on all your reporting requirements. And then talk early and often with us. Myself, my team, we're happy to try to provide some guidance, answer your questions. There's a variety of self-help material, FAQs, PowerPoints, guidance manuals, those type of documents on our website to kind of give you a little bit better understanding of how these programs function and work. And then next slide, please. And then contact information. I have my contact information here. The state's so large, this particular GIS map is showing you several different layers of GIS. One of them is the regional planning groups that I mentioned, and then our project teams. Typically, after a community submits the application, and it's deemed eligible, it will be turned over to one of these project application teams. These are guys like civil engineers, environmental reviewers, financial analysts, all those type of expertise to help put your formal application together and make sure that it's on time and on track to access these funds. That's one thing I failed to mention. When you submit that initial application, either in an abridged application or the project information form, that's just the initial step. If your project is deemed eligible, you'll be notified to submit a formal application. But when you're working on that formal application, the idea is you're working toward a known dollar amount, you're working to a known principal loan forgiveness percentage, those type of details, and you're working on trying to get all the documentation that we need in order to close that loan, and so you can move forward in the process and receive the funding. So that application process, again, is fall and spring. You'll be notified usually in late summer, September, if you're invited to receive a formal application or produce a formal application. And then I think the next slide is just a few resource links. We do such a wide variety of activities and programs at the Water Development Board. Just gave you just some cheat sheets on resource links, mainly on the New Texas Water Fund, guidance manuals, and just some general information on applications, funding applications, and financial assistance programs. And then the next slide, I think is the same thing, more, and then the final one. We'll go back one more, please. I wanted to highlight the TWDB newsletter. This is really true this year more so than any year I can remember in the past. Things are changing so rapidly. Please subscribe to our newsletter. That's a great resource to keeping up to date with timelines, deadlines, all the different details that I've mentioned this afternoon. You'll get it in a little bit more concise form by subscribing to our newsletter. And then the link just above that, the Texas Water Infrastructure Coordination Committee, TWIC for short. It's a great resource also. It's a group of state and federal agencies that have water-related infrastructure funding. And so they have their own website. They have a funding resource guide with contact information, gives you ideas about scope of work for a particular funding project and some contact information, and just the next steps of when you're looking for funding information for water-related infrastructure. It's just a great resource to have handy. That concludes all my presentation. I'm just going to take some questions, but just remember three things. We do have a lot of money now. We have supplemental federal dollars that are new to us since 2021. We have the new Texas Water Fund that's going through the implementation process. And then we still have our base programs that many people are familiar with. Several of those are active programs, are well-funded and available for communities looking for infrastructure options.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott, for sharing all that information with us. I know I learned a ton, so I appreciate that so much. We are going to take time for questions now. There are two ways that you can submit a question. You can either raise your hand. I will call on you to unmute your microphone and you can go ahead and ask your question verbally. Or if you'd like, you can put your question in the chat and I will read it for you. Scott, I was wondering, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could clarify something from someone who knows nothing about this. You had said that some of the funds, there's a 70% loan forgiveness and 30% gets paid back, but that changes from year to year. Can you talk more about why that changes and how they determine that change from year to year?
Yes, that's a great question. And those capacity dollar amounts for these, again, this is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. These are the two federal programs that we offer. So a lot of those rules and regulations are set by the Environmental Protection Agency. And so Texas has to follow their lead. And we do have some flexibility on how these programs are managed, but mainly we have to comply with the Environmental Protection Agency rules and regs. And so that is many communities, the way that program works over the years, systems are asked to submit surveys to the EPA on infrastructure needs. Those needs surveys, one for drinking water and one for wastewater, then go before a congressional session, and our congressional leadership then gets to divide up all the funding that's available between all 50 states and U.S. territories. And so that's kind of where that percentage breakdown and that dollar capacity amount comes from, is from EPA. That's a great question.
Gotcha. Thank you. Are there further questions? I did have another one, but I'll let someone else have a chance.
But one thing that I wanted to mention too that I didn't during the presentation, really what these water development board programs are kind of long-term capital planning, capital improvement projects. If you need money today or even 8 months from now, we may not be the best fit for you. But if you're kind of have projects identified in the utility master plan or capital improvements project or something you've been working on for quite a while, then that would kind of be those long-term projects that we can fund and finance for communities.
That's a great point. Dale has a question. Why does TWDB not have a water recreations plan? A lot of Texans are looking for local water resources. It's hard to get on most stretches of our rivers. Is there any way that you guys interact with the recreation piece of that, or why not?
There's definitely components when we're doing planning processes for water supply, especially on environmental needs, not specifically in recreation, but basically trying to improve the water quality by either watershed protection plans or something along those lines. Now, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, I know that they produce some documents and plans on more recreation related, and of course we do coordinate with that agency as long as, and of course Environmental Protection Agency and TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They're all kind of players or have input into those documents.
Great, thank you, Dale. That was a great question.
Yep.
We have time for about one more. Oh, I see Grace has a question. Is there a library or other repository of successful applications that we could review?
I don't think that there is a comprehensive list, but I'll take that back. There is a comprehensive list on our website. It's a new GIS application. It's under our financial assistance tab, and I don't remember exactly what it's called, but you can filter by program and look where the location of those projects have been, and you can click on one of the data bullet points and see exactly what the details are. Now, I want to back that up with something that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, it's called Financial Assistance Projects Interactive Dashboard. So it's our interactive dashboard on our website, and you can see some of those details. But one thing that you can really drill down to is on the federal programs, on the clean water and drinking water programs. You can see past applications from communities that have submitted applications. Not only that, you can see the dollar amounts, you can see if they were successful or if they didn't rank high enough in the process, or for whatever reason they withdrew their application, or they're ineligible. You can see all those details in that intended use plan document. And you can see our ranking system. You'll see typically, for instance, I think the drinking water application process last year, I think we got like 270 something applications, and we're able to fund maybe 40, 50, 60 of those projects. But you can see who ranked the highest and why they ranked the highest. There's a wide variety. I mentioned, economically distressed, if you're rural, if you're facing any type of regulatory action, but there's other criteria too, such as if your project's shovel ready, if it's in alignment with any other type of documents, such as the water plan or a water stream protection plan, watershed protection plan, hazard mitigation plan. If it's in alignment with those things too, you can obtain some points there. You can also obtain points by doing best management practices. Those are things like AWWA, the American Water Works Association, some of their best management practices, EPA best management practices, developing a comprehensive asset management plan, utility master plan, those type of things. So the idea, when communities are filling out these forms, the idea you're trying to obtain as many points as possible and be able to document those data points. We got to always be able to document everything. So if you can document those things, that helps a community rise higher in the ranking priority system.
That's a great question. Thank you, Grace. We have time for maybe one more. I did have another one if no one else has one.
Sure, go ahead.
You had mentioned in your slides some different types of projects that qualify, and some different funds had something that said green. Can you expand on that? Is that green infrastructure like nature-based solutions and low impact development, or is that something else?
It could be both of those things that you just mentioned. A lot of the green components are communities can switch to energy efficient pumps for their operation procedures. If they can document that, if they can upgrade their lighting, exterior lighting at like treatment plants and things like that, to energy efficient lighting, that's a green component. So it's a pretty broad statement, but it's pretty much anything to do with water or energy conservation or water and energy savings. And these projects, if you can identify or document what kind of savings you can realize by changing out equipment, that would be excellent documentation to provide to qualify for the green component.
Excellent, thank you.
Water reuse is a big project or a big component of the green also. So.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. A reminder, if you submitted an RSVP to this webinar, you will receive an email with the presentation slides and a link to the recording. Scott was also generous enough to provide a booklet that kind of outlines all the programs that he discussed today, and everyone will receive that as an attachment in their email, so you can have that as a reference going forward. All the webinar slides and recordings are going to be on NCTCOG's Water Resources website, which I put the link in the chat earlier. And you feel free to welcome me if you did not, or email me if you did not receive, if you did not RSVP but would like to receive those webinar materials. I'm going to put a link in the chat for a survey. This helps us improve on our water quality and water resources webinars going forward. Please feel free to give your anonymous feedback. We would love to hear your opinions. If there's nothing else, I want to thank you for attending today. I want to thank Scott Galloway again for joining us and sharing his wealth of information. Please feel free to reach out to Scott or myself if you have additional questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. This webinar is over now. You take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Scott.